I'd like to share 3 stories with you this morning. Jessica was an 11-year-old girl from a devout Christian family whose father had recently died of cancer. Her father was very active in her church community, and they attended church every week, but she opened up to me about how she had struggled with attending services since her father's death. "I'm not sure if I can pray to God anymore," she said. "I don't know if I can believe in a God who let this happen to my father." Samantha was a 12-year-old whose father had died by suicide a year and a half earlier. Being around other teens who'd had loved ones die by suicide gave her the courage to ask a question that she'd had in the back of her mind for over a year. "Can you go with me to call my mom?" she asked me. "I'm ready to find out how my dad killed himself." Max was a teenage boy whose dad had died 2 years earlier in a tragic, sudden car accident. During a hike, he shared how his dad's death had affected his identity. "Even though my dad's death was the most difficult thing that has ever happened to me, it's what made me who I am today. I'm not sure if I would be who I am if his death had not occurred." I witnessed these 3 stories at Camp Aaron, a 3-day grief camp for grieving children run by Our House Grief Support Center, where I've worked as a grief counselor for the last 2 summers. Like these 3 kids, every camper at Camp Aaron has experienced the death of a close loved one, usually a parent or a sibling, within the last 3 years. Camp is an immersive experience for these kids that combines fun camp activities like dances, rock climbing, tie-dye, with intensive grief therapy. Virtually none of the 100 children that attend each session of Camp Aaron have ever met each other, but it is truly extraordinary to witness the depth, openness, and power of the healing community that forms immediately over those 3 days. This morning, I want to explore with you what it is that makes Camp Aaron a place where such extraordinary healing can take place and what we can learn from it and bring back to our communities. Compared with other religions, Judaism gives us an extraordinary framework for supporting people during such a challenging time in their lives. First and foremost, Judaism emphasizes the centrality and importance of caring for mourners. In Hilchot Avel, Maimonides states that comforting mourners takes precedence over visiting the sick or celebrating with the bride and groom, as comforting mourners represents an expression of kindness not only to the dead, but also to the living, putting it in a category above virtually all other mitzvot. Additionally, Jewish tradition dictates that proper care of mourners requires the entire community to participate, not just family and friends. Chevrot Kadisha prepare the body on behalf of the mourners. Codes dictate that community members must provide meals for mourners during Shiva, as they can't be expected to provide for themselves during that time. And there is even a custom that a mourner's community has the obligation to literally guide them out of their formal mourning process, accompanying them on a walk around the block at the conclusion of Shiva, physically and metaphorically helping them to re-enter society. However, there are also some aspects of Jewish tradition that do not fully address mourners' needs. Though Jewish tradition may hold mourners' grief well during the days immediately following a death, in the space after Shiva, Jewish mourning practices don't necessarily mirror the realities of human grief. Whereas mourning is a formal public process that takes place immediately after a death, grief is a private journey that takes place over a much longer period of time. According to psychologist and grief expert J. William Worden, there are 4 tasks that mourners must address in order to work through their grief. Task 1, accept the reality of the loss. After a death, it's very normal for shock to set in, and it is easy to pretend that the death didn't happen simply to avoid the pain. Intellectually and emotionally accepting loss takes a lot of time. Task 2, process the pain of grief. Grief typically involves a wide range of emotions, feelings, and physiological responses, ranging from sadness, anger, and loneliness to relief and even happiness. There's no shortcut to processing the pain of grief. As one psychologist wrote, the prescription for grief is grieving. There is no way to get around all of these emotions and reactions other than feeling them and working through them. Task 3, adjust to a world without the deceased. This task involves coming to terms with secondary losses, recognizing that the deceased can no longer be at birthdays or at holidays, and that you may need to develop new skills and routines because of roles the deceased can no longer play in your life. Task 4, find an enduring connection to the deceased in the midst of embarking on a new life. To accomplish this task, a mourner typically develops new rituals and traditions aimed at honoring the deceased, seeking to maintain a loving connection with them emotionally while still actively living life in the present. Each person works through these 4 tasks of grief in their own way. Though these tasks build on each other, they are not necessarily linear, and often they need to be continually readdressed in new ways with the passage of time. Despite these realities of the task of human grief, Jewish tradition falls short in the space after Shiva, when mourners truly need to begin working through these tasks. Notably, in situations when a death occurs in the days before a major Jewish holiday, Shiva is cut short and never resumed, truncating public mourning entirely. Even though Judaism sets up a graduated step-down mourning process with Shiva, Shloshim, and Yartzeit, in most situations, the full step-down is never used. Only for the death of parents is one designated a mourner for a full 12 months. After all other deaths, spouses, children, siblings, the mourner designation goes away after 30 days, and the grieving process is presumed complete. On top of these time restrictions on formal mourning periods, the rabbis were also very careful to emphasize that it is inappropriate to comfort mourners after their mourning period ends. In one Talmudic anecdote, Rabbi Meir even states that comforting a mourner after their mourning period is akin to opening a healed wound, literally re-breaking someone's leg after it has already healed. Today, we obviously understand grief very differently than Rabbi Meir. But the reality remains that we as a society are largely uncomfortable with expressions of grief outside of the public mourning process. It's not an easy subject for any of us to talk about, but it's one that merits our attention. As Warden's 4 tasks of mourning teach us, grief is something that never fully goes away after a death, but rather that morphs and changes over time, reappearing in new iterations with each twist and turn of life. Simply put, grief does not stop in the space after Shiva, and we cannot expect it to. That space after Shiva is where we can all learn from Camp Aaron. So why is it that Camp Aaron is successful? First and foremost, Camp Aaron is a place where grief is public, a place where death is talked about, not brushed under the rug. It's a place where campers can say the things they are thinking that they feel they cannot say anywhere else in their lives. Because grief is public, Camp Aaron is also a place where grief becomes shared. Because campers are encouraged to voice the things that they can't say elsewhere, they realize that the feelings and experiences they are having are normal and that they are not grieving alone. Because grief is shared publicly, Camp Aaron is a place where grief is understood. Grief becomes a common language, a common understanding, and a common fabric of being. It is an everyday lived reality for the entire community. Because grief is understood, resources can be provided, and Camp Aaron becomes a place of healing where campers actively learn how to deal with their grief. While not every community is quite literally a grief camp filled with recently bereaved children, beneath the surface, every single community is filled with mourning and grief. Grief is something that every person is touched by and will continue to be in new and different ways throughout their lives. Here in this room today, there are people all around us actively grieving for their loved ones on a daily basis, even if they do not always allow that grief to show through to the surface. Imagine the healing that could take place if grief was more public, more shared, and more understood here, and in the communities that we will all go on to serve. While no community can be all things to all people, and there are of course limits on what a community can be expected to provide, as Jewish leaders, we have an obligation to explore the space after Shiva and work towards building communities that truly embrace grievers and support them on their journeys. Communities that meet grievers where they are in their grief and provide support whenever it is wanted. What could our communities look like if we made it a priority to provide a space after Shiva? How much healing could take place if we created in-house grief groups, revisioned our caring communities, or encouraged grievers to seek outside grief therapy? How much healing could take place if we simply made an effort to educate our communities about the realities of grief and normalize that grieving continues actively in the space after Shiva? How would it feel if talking about grief after Shiva felt safe? How would it feel if people knew their grief could be understood by others? Mourning is a uniquely personal process, and every single person works through the tasks of grieving in their own individual way. By recognizing and embracing the reality that each one of us is constantly dealing with these 4 tasks in new and different ways, and by providing people with the space that they need to wrestle with these tasks publicly as they see fit, we have the opportunity to create communities that truly embrace and support grievers. On the last night at Camp Aaron, campers have the opportunity to design memorial candles called luminaries for their loved ones and publicly say goodbye as they light these candles and place them on the pool during a ceremony. During this ceremony, Max, the same teenage boy who spoke so compellingly about how his dad's death shaped his identity, also spoke to the power of grieving communities as he paid tribute to his father. I notice that all of our luminaries are surrounded by other candles. None of them is floating by itself. Our luminaries represent all of us because when we come to places like Camp Aaron, we realize that no one grieves alone.